I'll try and encompass the main political developments that were dealt with at the European School in the course of my opening contribution. And really, we face an incredible position of marvellous mass movements, to some extent unprecedented, really, in the history of the workers' movement itself. Turkey, Brazil, Egypt, South Africa, in which I participated a few months ago with our South African section in the tumultuous movements that are taking place there, with the creation of WASP, the Workers' and Socialist Party, which has great prospects now of developing, particularly in relation to the elections that will take place in South Africa next year. And all of these movements have demonstrated the colossal power of the working class once they get on the move. No longer will it be possible to argue from a world point of view. We might say this about the situation in Britain or in certain countries in Europe, that there's a quiescent mood. But that's not the scenario that is developing on a world scale. With the huge mass movements that have convulsed societies in the countries that I've mentioned. The mass occupation in the squares in Turkey, actually the biggest in the history of Turkey itself, followed up by actions of the working class in Egypt. Let us recall here tonight, a matter of a month or so ago, 22 million people signed a petition for the removal of Morsi in Egypt, followed by 17 million people. That was the general figure that was given. The opposition said it was 33 million people that came out onto the streets of the cities of Egypt in the mass demonstration that led to the overthrow of Morsi himself. That second revolution, as it was called, was bigger than the numbers that were involved in the first movement 2 years ago. In Brazil, on the other hand, the floodgates of revolution was opened, and that's what it really means, because a revolution is not one act, but the movement that took place was the beginning of a process of colossal radicalization of Brazil. We had a human tide that swept from one end of the country. Actually, it's a misnomer to describe Brazil as a country. It's a semi-continent, where, for instance, in Belém, in the Amazon basin, where myself and Peter Taaffe visited about 3 or 4 years ago, down to Porto Alegre in the south, practically every city was convulsed with mass movements of the working class in the course of what developed in the past month alone. That was triggered by a 10% increase in the fares in Sao Paulo that brought the initial mass movement onto the streets itself. It indicates the dire crisis which exists in Brazilian society, notwithstanding that there's been an actual growth in the productive forces and the raising of living standards in Brazil. Prior to this movement, there's also an uneven development in capitalism in the neo-colonial world, with an archaic infrastructure in transport, for instance, where they haven't really developed, if you like, a map of or a tube system. One of the demands, it seemed particularly bizarre, is on the streets of Sao Paulo they were holding up a map of the London Tube and a map of the metro and saying, this is what we want. When we were in Brazil, our comrades told us it takes 6 hours to travel from one part of Sao Paulo to the other, such as the backwardness of the infrastructure and particularly of transport itself. And these increases were cancelled out just like that by the government as a result of the movement that took place. Probably 120 cities saw demonstrations of one kind or another. In Fortaleza, which is the 5th most unequal city in the world, it's surrounded by 400 poverty-stricken favelas. At one stage, there was 2 million workers on the streets of Brazil at one particular moment in time, and the depth of the crisis is indicated. I mentioned about the football match taking place in Birmingham, but actually highly symptomatic of the way that this movement reached into the very depths of society was the fact that you had, for the first time, even on British television, when they were covering the Confederation Cup, Gary Lineker, or one of the commentators, said at one stage, we have to inform you today at this match there are more people protesting outside the stadiums than are inside the stadiums itself. Probably a bit like Coventry City and the protest that has taken place there, where Dave Nellis and our comrades in Coventry have made a tremendous intervention on that issue, which is not just a question of football. It goes to the heart, really, of the control which is exercised in society at this particular moment in time. And we have to emphasize one point. This has been an urban movement. You know, in the past we would have meetings like this. We would have to argue against other brands of Marxism, if you like, who argued whether the guerrilla struggle was more important. That, for instance, the IRA guerrilla struggle, so-called, in Northern Ireland was the road to victory for the working class. We had to argue that no, it was the working class in its organised form, in the general strikes, in the traditional methods of the working class that would prove to be decisive in relation to what took place. And really in Latin America, now the overwhelming majority of the population live in the cities. In China, by the way, for the first time, more than 50% live in the cities at this moment in time. In the Middle East and North Africa, within the Arab world, it's about 350 million people live, yet 2/3 of the population of that region live in the cities itself. That shows that the working class and the city poor are the overwhelming majority of society. They are the most decisive force when it comes down to it in the movement, if you like, to change society. And even where the working class is a minority in its traditional organised form, industrial workers, white-collar workers working in the offices, there's a huge mass of urban poor. Nevertheless, that small section of the working class is decisive for us and is decisive for the process of revolution in these countries itself. These events were watched avidly by the working class worldwide. In a way, it was a conscious expression, or an unconscious expression to be more exact, of the way that internationalism now seems to be organic in the approach of working people, through the television, through the mass media, and so on. In other words, the world is bound together with iron hoops. It actually reinforces internationalism, and particularly the role of the CWI. No movement can take place in a single country now, particularly the big countries like Egypt or like Brazil, without evoking a tremendous response internationally, particularly from the youth, the most oppressed and frustrated section of society. That's prepared the ground for the internationalism upon which our organisation, the CWI, is based at this moment in time. And after the overthrow of Mubarak, we said that that movement would not be the end of the matter. In Egypt, there was bound to be a second revolution. Why did we say that? It's based upon an analysis of the laws of revolution that we set out, for instance, in our book on the French Revolution itself. Marx and Engels studied the French Revolution, not just the Russian Revolution that we study, or we study other revolutions, but in the French Revolution, to understand the laws of motion, if you like, of society, the laws of revolution itself. And it is a law that it is the masses who make the revolution. That was the case in the French Revolution, through the sans-culottes, the men and women without property. Literally, it meant the men without trousers in the case of the sans-culottes. They were so poor. That movement is inevitable that they will make it. But then, on the morrow of the victory, the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois step in and gather up the power into their hands. That was openly recognized by the masses, if you like, in Egypt, which was summed up by the slogan before the recent events that Morsi is Mubarak with a beard. In other words, fundamentally, nothing could really change in the society itself. It's particularly important that we see these movements taking place as a reflection of what is happening in the depths of society, particularly in the aspirations of working people, particularly in the economy itself. Our conclusion that we mentioned at our conference, that we are on the eve of the greatest events in human history. Maybe even some of our own comrades were a little bit skeptical about that. That was not said as an incidental agitational point. It was an indication of the objective situation that is developing within society at the present time. You can give many facts and figures. I'm going to be a bit sparing on facts and figures tonight, but I'll give one fact to indicate the dilemma facing capitalism at this stage. According to The Economist, almost 290 million young people are neither working nor studying. Almost a quarter of the planet's youth are forced out of employment or training at this present time. That's a terrible indictment of the system itself. This, by the way, provided the initial impulse of the movement in Egypt itself from below. It was an important, if not a decisive factor that led to the first and now the second revolution in Egypt. For instance, 1,500 factories closed since the first revolution under the Morsi government. Half of the country's 80 million people are living below the poverty line or near it. Big strikes have taken place of the working class. An increase in strikes. 78% of workers have only temporary work in Egypt at the present time. But the overthrow of Morsi by the army was a combination of a movement, a mass mobilization of the working class, disappointed by the first revolution, but also by the conscious intervention of the army, and unfortunately supported by some on the left, such as the SWP supporters in Egypt, who greeted the removal of Morsi uncritically. We do not or should not support any other forces than the conscious movement of the working class. It was not just the working class in this movement or the poor. It was industrialists. It was former supporters of Mubarak. It was the police. It was representatives of the deep state, if you like. In other words, the remnants of the Mubarak regime that remained intact after the first revolution itself. And we have the responsibility of warning on all occasions that the working class should always seek an independent position as far as a movement like this is concerned. And particularly when you looked at those who supported this coup. They said it wasn't a coup, it was a deposal. That's what took place with the removal of Morsi. Saudi Arabia rushed in. Qatar rushed in to support the army or support the new regime. And now, of course, in the last couple of days, we have seen the temporary release of Mubarak, which represents really a victory for the counter-revolution. The Financial Times says today, this very day, Saturday, today, it said, well, the Arab Spring has given way to a totalitarian summer. It's a rather loose expression, but it's an indication that in the movement that is developing, it is a process of revolution and of counter-revolution. And we have to clearly differentiate between what is progressive in any movement and what is potentially reactionary and will be used against the working class and the masses at a later stage. And in this respect, we pointed, didn't we, to the intervention in Libya, when some on the left, like the Alliance, the misnamed Alliance for Workers' Liberty, supported the intervention of imperialism in Libya. We said this was an intervention, irrespective of what was said about the interests of the Libyan people. This was the foothold that imperialism was looking for in order to establish a base for the counter-revolution and to give a certain legitimacy then for an intervention that would take place elsewhere. That has led to the intervention in Bahrain, to the intervention now in Syria. And it's an absolute catastrophe for the peoples of Syria. We had people saying to us, why aren't you supporting the opposition in Syria? And we said, we support the independent movement of the working class. But we give no support to those sectarians on either side. We don't support Assad. We don't support the opposition. We stand for an independent working class to build up the power of the working class, the organizations of the working class on the trade union level and on the political level as well. And now in this catastrophe, it has all the hallmarks of what happened in Iraq. this latest gas attack that has taken place. Who knows who's responsible? Maybe Assad and his forces, or some sections of them, are behind it. It's more likely that Al-Qaeda type forces have intervened in this way, or some elements in touch with imperialism. The tragedy of Syria is that 10% probably support Assad, 10% are supporting the opposition, and 80% want this nightmare to be over. And the only force that can answer that, I repeat, is the organisations of the working class itself. The Egyptian army is not like the Portuguese army in 1974 that provided the spark that led to the Portuguese Revolution. That army had been radicalised by the colonial wars in Africa. The leading elements were already in touch with the workers' organisations. The Egyptian army is really a guard of private property. And in the case of Egypt, a lot of the private property is actually in the hands of the army themselves. They have huge stakes in capitalism itself. In other words, the deep state, like what we've had in Pakistan, has got a base in the situation that is developing there. What is likely to happen in Egypt in the next period? Well, it'll be a drawn-out process. There's an independent movement. There's independent trade unions. Unfortunately, politically confused. Some of them will be drawn into the administration at the present time. Our job is to reach the best elements there, like we are doing in Tunisia, where we've got a very good base with some of the radical elements now against Ennahda, working within the trade unions and within the left organisations that are developing, with real possibilities for the development of our organisation itself. The CWI, this area is a vital area for the CWI. We've got a toehold at the present time, but I think that in the next period we have to try and strengthen our position in this region, in Tunisia, in Egypt itself, where some marvellous work has been done in the past. It's very dangerous work, but we have to find a way through the resources of the CWI to intervene in the situation that is developing there. In Brazil, on the other hand, this movement developed partly because there was such a development of industry in the course of the last decade. That in turn was fueled by the enormous market that was provided for raw materials from Brazil. And that led to a big growth rate and brought out of poverty big sections of the population who were kept in poverty in the favelas and so on, who were brought into the mainstream of Brazilian life. And as a result of that, that was a good thing. Marxists don't say that a small boom is a bad thing. In Britain at the present time, I wish that some of the prognostications, some of the predictions that there's a boom taking place or a recovery taking place. The reality is, perspectives for the economy mean that this year it's likely to increase rather than 0.6% to 0.7%. Wow, what an enormous step forward for society. In Brazil, there was a growth rate between 5 and 10%. That enormously strengthened the working class. It led to the biggest strike wave in 28 years, where the workers moved onto the scene demanding their share. I wish we had a small growth in the development of industry in Britain, because it would lead to the working class feeling more confidence and being prepared to move into the situation itself. But Brazil now, the bottom has dropped out of the economy. And we are very firmly based in Brazil in our small organisation. We didn't lose our head in this recent movement. Some of the left, in the Morenoite organisation, it's a Trotskyist organisation. It's got significant cadres. They're quite strong and so on. But in the course of the movement, once the movement developed, which brought from all layers of society the most uneducated, the most naive sections. And then the right wing intervened. In fact, openly, fascist elements tried to intervene and say, no politics. And this frightened some of the left. And they actually started to discuss the theory or the possibility of a coup. We said it's not possible for a coup to take place at this moment in time because of the relationship of forces. In Greece, we see the way now there's been an open discussion in the press and in the right wing of the possibility of Golden Dawn entering the government alongside New Democracy. Now, if that happened, That would be the equivalent of what happened in Spain in 1934, 35, when Gil Robles, representing clerical reaction, entered the right-wing government at that stage. That led to the Asturian Commune, to the uprising in the mining areas itself. This would represent the equivalent. But they're very careful. They're hesitating about going down this road because that would inflame the opposition of the working class and lead really to the elements that are there now to the possibility of an outright civil war. It's not an accident, by the way. Just before the Second World War, the insurance companies in Britain were refusing to insure against the threat of civil war. That was because they could see what was coming. Something similar, not as conscious as that, something similar is taking place now in all the states of the advanced industrial countries and internationally as well. And Obama has gone along with this. In fact, the repression that Obama has carried out, now the Obama regime is being described as the fourth term of Bush in terms of the repression against the working class. That, by the way, is producing a very good situation for us because we've stood, as the comrades are aware, in Seattle, where our comrade has stood there, got a marvellous result in that election, where she came second and is now in a runoff against a right-wing Democrat for the seat in the Seattle Council. We've just heard, and by the way, with the support of local trade unions as well, we've also heard that in Seattle, in Minneapolis, our comrade there is being courted by all kinds of people. By the way, the repression that you've seen in other states also exists in Britain. Look at the revelations in the last couple of months about the YRA in relation to Lois, Hannah, and also now the other day Frank Smith. An incredible amount of detail. That's an indication of what the state is preparing, but no doubt that will be discussed tomorrow at the meeting on Britain itself. Frankly, there are enough laws now on the statute book to establish a police state in Britain or in the advanced industrial countries, but they cannot go over to a police state just like that. It's the relationship of class forces that prevents them from going over to this situation. And from a world point of view, capitalism has no way forward. One of the questions that are in the minds of many of our comrades is the problems of world capitalism economically. They look intractable at the present time. But is there a way out? Well, look at the details of what is taking place in the US at the moment. They're talking about a recovery. The US has actually recovered in absolute production back to the level of seven years ago, of 2008, 6 years ago, 2007, 2008. And yet in health, in education, in unemployment and so on, the situation is dire as far as the masses are concerned. Look at the strikes that are taking place now of workers in the fast food industry. What's striking about them, by the way, these strikes, so to speak, is that these are not just young people who are taking a temporary job. Whole families are involved in low wage, and that's coming to Britain as well, in low wage employment. And the ground is being prepared for a big movement amongst these workers, similar to what we saw taking place in the last stage of the 19th century itself. In the book that I'm going to review for Socialism today, if I get the time when I get back, is this book on that's being produced on the Great Unwinding in the US. And it's packed full of devastating figures that means there's going to be a mass eruption in America. The most devastating for me was that this guy goes around America and interviews different sections of society. Any comrades you've read, John Dos Passos USA, it's based upon that book with headlines in the press and a story told of different people in the US. And in one of these articles, he points out that in 1980, 50% of the American population, 50% of parents, thought that the living standards of their children would not reach the level that they'd had in their lifetime. Now, 80% of the parents of the US do not believe their children will reach the level of standard of living that they've got. In the suburbs, which was once synonymous with white flight and the collapse of the inner cities and symbolic of the boom, there's more poor now in the suburbs than there is in the inner cities. And if you don't have a car, you're absolutely done in that situation. This is preparing a mass eruption against what is now a dysfunctional system, where you can see that a movement is being prepared in the unions, amongst the working class. And our organisation is very audacious in the way that we're intervening. There's another factor, by the way, that could mean that in the US they might even overtake the working class of Europe, of old Europe. The European working class is the oldest working class in the world, not literally, but the most experienced working class in the world. That brings with it a certain amount of baggage. The US has not experienced for really since the 1930s, and then only in a very small layer of society, has not experienced socialism. Really didn't have the same psychology in relation to Stalinism. So it's not the same kind of barrier in the consciousness, particularly of new layers who move into action. And therefore a movement can develop in America with American speed, like we saw in the first decade of the 20th century with the development on the trade unions, which resulted in Eugene Debs getting 3 million votes in the 1912 election, standing on formally a revolutionary program. That's the equivalent to 6 million votes today. We are at the forefront of this movement as it's developing at the present time. There is no possibility of capitalism developing a sustained movement that can show a way out for capitalism. That does not mean to say there can't be within a general stagnation of the productive forces a certain conjunctural development. For instance, in the US, because it's improved slightly, that's given confidence to workers in the US, particularly in fast food, to say, right, you're making big profits, we want our share, and they've moved into action. And our comrades have been sufficiently aware that they've intervened in that movement itself. On the other hand, look at our heroic section of the CWI in China. And China is on the eve, in my opinion, of real mass movements taking place. The last couple of days has revealed the rottenness of the Chinese elite in the trial of Bo Xilai, in which he's revealed, the press today is full of it, in which it's revealed that his son was educated in Harvard, as he was, by the way, and yet he's a member of the Communist Party, a so-called princeling, and that the Prime Minister of China is also a princeling. And this son of Bo Xilai actually was revealed in the corruption case, which is in the press today, in which they say that he took 50 of his workmates, or his classmates in Harvard, over to a visit to China, to Shanghai and Chongqing, paid for by his father and by the state. 40 to 50. They treated lavishly and so on. The reason why this has come out is the regime is trying to discredit Bo Xilai and say, look, he's a corrupt man. But what's happened is it's been streamed online. It's provoked a huge discussion and a debate amongst the Chinese people, particularly the youth online. Why are they doing it? Because he, in Chongqing, while he's corrupt and while he's a member of a privileged elite, he also raised radical ideas in relation to Mao and so on. And the Chinese government were afraid of that, because they're afraid of anything that will provoke a movement of the working class. Therefore, I would say that the slowdown in China, really from a growth rate of over 10%, now possibly to 7% this year, maybe less, maybe slightly more, but we will never have a return to double-digit growth in China for the foreseeable period. And that in turn will provoke a movement of the masses. Not a movement like we see, for instance, in Greece or in Spain, against austerity, against poverty and so on. This is more like a movement of rising expectations. It's like what happened in France between 1958 and 1968, when de Gaulle was a parliamentary Bonapartist using armed guards against the trade unionists in the factories and provoked the greatest general strike in history as a result of the measures that he took, which led to the 68 events that some of us lived through at that particular time. There's a massive debt crisis in China. The slowing down of the economy is like a jumbo jet that slows down. But when a jumbo jet slows down too much, it falls out of the sky. And that will provoke a revolution. And I think that that is on the agenda of the workers' movement and on the agenda of the movement in China in this period that we're going into. One of the things that has sustained world capitalism up to recently is in the so-called developing world, particularly Asia, They seem to have overcome or surmounted the problems that the European capitalism has had. Claire Doyle did a very good article for the website. Today, the points that were raised in that have been substantiated by the developments, for instance, in India, that had stellar growth, that is now contracting quite dramatically. And why is it contracting? Because these countries have been buoyed up by the quantitative easing of US capitalism, the injection of fictitious capital. Now Bernanke is beginning to withdraw. That so-called tapering program has taken place, and that in turn has led to the slowdown of virtually all the economies of Asia, apart from China itself. This period we're going into is going to be a period of a long, drawn-out crisis of capitalism. The depths of the crisis has stunned the working class. And that's one of the problems we have in Europe at the moment. Why comrades have turned towards and why the working class are looking towards the developments in Turkey or the developments in China or the developments in the Middle East is it opens up, it seems to open up a new field of a mass movement of the working class. But Europe is still the key. It's the strongest base for the CWI. The movement in Greece, the movement in Spain, which is a very important development. Hopefully that will come up in the course of the discussion. Real possibilities exist there for us to develop our position. There is an anti-party mood. To be more exact, there's an anti-capitalist party mood. I saw it when I was in Spain last week, even on the beach, when a young lad says to me, I'm off. As soon as I get my qualification, I'm off. Where are you going? I'm going to Britain. Why? Well, to get a job. Well, there's 1 million people who don't have jobs and not in education, young people. Well, I'll go there, or I might try Germany. After all, they've caused our problems. So I'll go to Germany and try and get a job in Germany. In other words, the whole of the youth of Europe are like the Irish were in the past. Their major export is people, desperately looking for a way out. And on the other hand, the workers' movement is stalled because of the lack of leadership of the movement itself. But nevertheless, it's wrong for us to think that the masses are not learning by this process. After the heroic strikes in Greece, we just had a camp in Greece, and the comrades were very surprised at the number of people who turned out to the camp. It was quite a big camp. And one of the explanations of that is people don't have enough money to go on holiday today, so they go to a camp. They even come to this in the rain. And so this will grow in the future. I'm combined with that. I might not be here, but I think that these kind of camps could grow in the future if they have a political and a youthful character. So they attended our camp. But these movements have left a stamp on the outlook of the working class. The masses have not yet found a party or an organisation on a broad scale that they can believe in, that they can build and can be a weapon to change society itself. We're in a process of revolution and of counter-revolution, not just in the Middle East, not just in Brazil, not just in Turkey. And we've just had the first lines in Turkey, the overture, if you like, to the symphony to come, in which all the themes of the movement were there in the opening lines in this recent mass movement. We just saw the beginning of this taking place. And a similar process will take place also in the course of the movement in Europe as well. The bourgeois themselves understand much better, that's the thinkers of the bourgeois, understand much better what is taking place in society than the so-called leaders of the working class. Look at the squabble. Look at the catastrophe within the ranks of New Labour, where you have now, even in the Mirror, something like 40-odd% of the people who are polled have no confidence in Miliband. And in the last couple of days, Peter Hain and John Denham wrote a critical piece in which they urge Miliband to stick to his guns. And what's their programme? For responsible capitalism. When the masses see there's no possibility of that, just trimming here and trimming there is not a solution to the problem. We're on the eve of big movements. It's very difficult. When the pressure comes on a small organisation with all the problems that are developing in relation to that, and comrades sometimes have difficulties of seeing how the masses will move. Well, I've quoted recently the experience of Trotsky on the eve of the First World War, when he was speaking to a number of bourgeois. And these bourgeois said to him, he came down and he said, yes, revolution will take place. Remember, this is 2013, next year will be 2014, and there'll be an avalanche of books on the First World War. We have to use that opportunity, not just to explain the catastrophe of the First World War, but what came out of the First World War, the greatest revolutionary wave in human history and the first democratic worker state. But what happened in 1914 is a handful of people understood what was going on. The bourgeois themselves understood. And Trotsky was discussing with them. He said he was surprised. The economists, by the way, at the time came to the same conclusion. And they said to Trotsky, well, yes, out of this will come a catastrophe, a social catastrophe. There will be a revolution. We've got no doubt about that. There will be a revolutionary wave. But they believed that they would ride it out because they looked at the tops of the labour movement and they saw the social democratic leaders, even then, who developed in a period of an organic growth of capitalism, became comfortable, adapted to the system, and they thought, well, these people are never going to struggle for the kind of society that they talk about in words. And then, of course, Trotsky makes the point, at Zimmerwald in 1915, the number of revolutionaries were gathered together in 2 stagecoaches. That was the number. 2 years later, the working class of Russia was in power. And what they'd not seen, they couldn't see it on the horizon at that stage, was the existence of the Bolshevik Party, the existence of Lenin, who had no more than 1% share of the vote at the beginning of the Russian Revolution in February. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that is the masses are not moving at this stage for a number of reasons. One is they're still stunned by the collapse and the rapidity of the collapse of 2007-2008. They're disappointed with the trade union and labour leaders of not showing a way forward. They've shown their willingness to struggle in Greece, in Spain and so on, and now they're pondering the events. There's also an element, well, maybe the worst is over, and we'll get back to the position prior to 2007-2008. Once they see that will not develop, a ferocious movement of opposition will develop. Our task is to put ourselves at the head of this movement, and in that way seize all the opportunities to create a powerful pole of attraction which can offer a way forward for the working class. It won't develop easily. The movement, the labour movement, is fractured at the present time. That's why in Greece we put forward not just a programme, a general abstract programme, but a concrete programme of bringing the best of the left who are prepared to struggle around as a focal point of our organisation. In Spain, with a handful of people, we're putting forward the idea of uniting the left inside the IU, the United Left. And that's found an echo, because the best workers, they see the need for unity in action. That's what we're doing in Tusk. That's what we're doing in the shop stewards network. We're not doing it in an unprincipled way. When we come up in a debate and a discussion, we call things by the right name. We put our position, but we also say we're prepared to struggle with you if that's a partial programme, if that's the prevailing view of the movement itself. In that way, we'll find the road to the best workers. And in that sense, we will build a powerful pole of attraction, especially in this next period, I would say. This discussion, if it's to mean anything, has to raise our level of understanding from the oldest comrade or the most experienced to the newest comrade who's here today. But over and above that, there's no automaticity in history. You have to prepare history by gathering together the conscious forces of the movement itself in our organisation. And that means recruiting people. It means each comrade here having a programme and a target to recruit, of building our party to 2,500 in Britain in the next period. And from then, to go further than that. And you know, Trotsky mentioned at one stage, he pointed to Australia and he said, the bourgeois press has commented that the Communist Party of Australia's got 1,000 members. But that 1,000 members moves 1 million workers in the trade unions itself. Don't underestimate that that is possible with our organisation. What can be considered as a little sect, not in its programme, but in its numbers, a small sect, can rapidly transform into a major force, particularly in the kind of situation now where the bureaucracy is weakened because of the pressure from below, where Miliband and co are incapable of answering up to the situation. Through our work, we can establish a pole of attraction in Britain and worldwide that can show a way forward to the working class in the next period and make this century, the 21st century, the century when socialism was established through the mass organisation of a revolutionary party in Britain and replicating that on a world scale.